For centuries, the sea was considered a man's world. Ships were brutal places filled with violence, disease, and death. Women were believed to bring bad luck aboard a vessel, yet some women defied every rule and expectation. They dressed like men, fought like men, and ruled like legends. Names like Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Ching Shi, and Grace O'Malley still echo through history. But very few people talk about what happened when these women lost their freedom. When a female pirate was captured, her nightmare was only beginning. The moment of capture itself was often savage. Naval officers and bounty hunters showed no mercy. Female pirates were beaten, stripped, and humiliated in front of entire crews. Many were chained immediately, not just as prisoners, but as trophies. Authorities wanted to prove that women who stepped outside their roles would be punished worse than men. Once brought ashore, the real terror began. Female pirates were usually imprisoned in filthy, overcrowded cells. These were not prisons as we imagine today. They were dark stone rooms crawling with rats, lice, and disease. Food was scarce and water was often contaminated. But for women, imprisonment came with additional horrors. Guards frequently abused their power, and female prisoners had almost no protection. Many were assaulted repeatedly, knowing that no one would ever punish the men responsible. Interrogations were brutal. Authorities wanted names, routes, hidden treasure locations, and confessions. Torture was common. Women were whipped, burned, starved, or suspended by their wrists for hours. Their screams echoed through stone corridors, but mercy was rare. The idea was simple: break them completely, physically and mentally, so no woman would ever dare follow their path again. Public humiliation was another weapon. Captured female pirates were often paraded through towns in chains. Crowds gathered not just to see criminals, but to stare at women who had dared to fight, kill, and command men. People threw rotten food, spat on them, and screamed insults. They were called monsters, witches, whores, and demons. The goal was to erase any trace of admiration and replace it with fear. Trials were swift and cruel. Unlike male pirates, female pirates were often judged more harshly. Courts focused less on their crimes and more on their gender. Judges openly condemned them for abandoning womanhood, motherhood, and obedience. Many trials were little more than performances, designed to deliver a predetermined sentence. Guilt was assumed from the start. Execution was the most common outcome. Hanging was the standard punishment for piracy, and female pirates were no exception. But their executions were often turned into public spectacles. Women were forced to wear dresses, even if they had lived their entire pirate lives disguised as men. This was done deliberately to remind the crowd that these were women who had stepped out of line. The gallows were placed in busy areas so everyone could watch. Some women were forced to stand beneath the noose for hours before the execution, listening to sermons about sin and damnation. When the trapdoor finally opened, death was not always quick. Poorly tied ropes meant slow strangulation. Broken necks were not guaranteed, and some women suffered for minutes as crowds watched in silence or cheered. But hanging was not the worst fate. Some female pirates were sentenced to be gibbeted. This meant their bodies were displayed in iron cages after death, hanging near harbors or shorelines. Their corpses rotted in public view for weeks or even months. The message was clear: this is what happens to women who rebel. Burning at the stake was another terrifying punishment, especially in regions where piracy was linked to witchcraft. Women were accused of using dark magic to control ships, seduce sailors, or summon storms. Flames erased not only their lives but any record of who they truly were. Transportation was another fate that awaited some female pirates. Instead of execution, a few were sentenced to transportation to distant colonies. This was often portrayed as mercy, but it was a slow death. Women were shipped in horrific conditions to places like the Caribbean, Australia, or Africa. Many died during the journey from disease, starvation, or abuse. Those who survived were sold into forced labor or servitude, spending the rest of their lives working under brutal conditions with no hope of return. Pregnancy sometimes delayed execution, but it did not save lives. Some famous female pirates claimed pregnancy to avoid the gallows. Courts would temporarily delay execution until after childbirth. But once the child was born, the sentence was usually carried out anyway. Infants were taken away, sold, or abandoned. Mothers were marched back to the gallows, their brief hope crushed. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are among the most well-known examples. Both were captured in 1720. During their trial, they shocked the court by revealing their pregnancies. This saved them temporarily, but Mary Read died in prison from fever, possibly worsened by childbirth. Anne Bonny's fate remains unclear, but many historians believe she was released only because her wealthy father intervened. Even then, her pirate life was over, erased by shame and silence. Not all female pirates died by execution. Some disappeared into forced marriages. Authorities believed marriage could reform dangerous women. Female pirates were sometimes married off to men chosen by the state or their families. These marriages were rarely consensual. Many women were essentially handed from one prison to another, their freedom permanently destroyed. Others were sold into slavery. Captured female pirates, especially those of African or Asian descent, were often enslaved rather than executed. Their skills as sailors, navigators, or fighters were ignored. They were reduced to property, forced to work in plantations or households until death. Psychological punishment followed survivors for life. Women who escaped execution lived under constant surveillance. They were banned from ports, ships, and coastal towns. Any suspicion could lead to rearrest. Many lived under false names, hiding their past in fear. Trauma haunted them. Nightmares of chains, cells, and gallows never left. Society made sure their stories were rewritten. Female pirates were turned into cautionary tales. Songs, pamphlets, and sermons portrayed them as immoral women who deserved their fate. Their bravery, leadership, and intelligence were erased. History reduced them to villains or curiosities, stripping them of humanity. In some cultures, their punishments were even more extreme. In parts of Asia, captured female pirates were mutilated. Ears, noses, or fingers were cut off as permanent marks of shame. These women were released only to live as outcasts, easily identifiable and forever punished. In China, during the era of the powerful pirate leader Qin Shi, captured women faced execution or forced conscription into state-controlled labor. Ironically, Qin Shi herself negotiated a peaceful surrender and escaped punishment entirely, proving how rare survival truly was. The cruelty served a larger purpose. Authorities feared female pirates not just because they broke the law, but because they challenged the social order. Women commanding ships, fighting men, and living freely threatened everything patriarchal societies stood for. Punishing them brutally was meant to scare others into obedience. What makes these stories even more disturbing is how little was recorded. Many female pirates were executed without names, listed simply as woman pirate. Their lives vanished into silence. We will never know how many there truly were or how many suffered unseen. Even after death, peace was denied. Families were often forbidden from claiming bodies. Burial was refused, leaving corpses to decay or be thrown into unmarked graves. The sea that once gave them freedom did not even grant them a final resting place. Today, movies and books glamorize female pirates, showing fearless women sailing into sunsets. But the reality was far more brutal. Freedom came at an unimaginable cost, and capture meant a fate worse than death for many. These women were not monsters. They were survivors of poverty, abuse, war, and injustice. Many turned to piracy because it offered the only escape from forced marriages, servitude, or starvation. Yet history punished them more harshly than the men who committed the same crimes. When you hear tales of pirate queens and women of the sea, remember this hidden ending. Remember the chains, the trials, the gallows, and the silence that followed. Their stories were meant to be erased, but by telling them, we bring them back from the shadows. If this story shocked you, disturbed you, or made you see history differently, then it has done its job. The past is not just glory and adventure.